The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Chez Laurent, an upscale bistro in downtown Los Angeles where reservations were harder to get than Oscars. At 59, Johnny Depp had learned to appreciate quiet corners and dim lighting, places where his weathered face could blend into shadows. He sat alone at table 7, wearing a worn leather jacket and faded jeans, his signature rings catching the candlelight. The divorce proceedings had drained him, the media circus had exhausted him, and tonight he just wanted to eat in peace. The waiter, a young man named Marcus, 23 and starstruck, kept glancing over but maintained professional distance. Johnny appreciated that. He'd been coming here for months, and they'd learned to treat him like any other customer. But tonight felt different. There was a tension in the air, an electricity that made his skin crawl. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, studying him with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey. The pasta grew cold on his plate as he pushed it around absently, his mind wandering to the Virginia courthouse where his reputation had been dissected like a lab specimen. He'd won the case, but at what cost? His face was leaner now, his eyes more hollow, carrying the weight of battles fought in public view. The restaurant's warm ambience felt like a sanctuary, but even here, he couldn't escape the sensation of being observed, judged, measured against some invisible standard. His phone buzzed with messages from his publicist, but he ignored them. Tonight, he was just a man trying to find peace in a bowl of linguine and a glass of wine that tasted like forgiveness. At the bar, a man in his early 40s nursed his third whiskey, his eyes fixed on Johnny's table. Rick Brennan was a construction worker from Pittsburgh, visiting LA for his daughter's wedding. But he wasn't thinking about family celebrations tonight. He was thinking about the homeless man who'd been sitting at that corner table for over an hour, ordering expensive wine and acting like he owned the place. Rick had seen enough panhandlers in his time, and this one really got under his skin. The guy's clothes were shabby, his hair was unkempt, and he had that hollow look of someone who'd been living rough. Yet here he was, in a fancy restaurant, probably scamming innocent people out of their hard-earned money. Rick's jaw clenched as he watched the man casually sip a glass of wine that probably cost more than Rick made in a day. Something about the whole scene felt wrong, like a violation of everything Rick believed about working for what you get. The alcohol made his anger simmer hotter. Rick had worked construction for 23 years, his hands were calloused, his back ached every morning, and he'd earned every dollar the hard way. Seeing someone who looked like they'd given up on life sitting in luxury made his blood boil. He'd heard stories about LA, about the entitled, the fake, the people who thought they were better than everyone else. This vagrant was probably one of those street performers or wannabe actors who thought the world owed them something. Rick finished his whiskey and ordered another, his eyes never leaving the stranger at table 7. The man's mannerisms were odd too refined for someone down on their luck, too confident for someone who should be ashamed. Rick slammed his glass down and stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The restaurant's gentle murmur seemed to pause as he walked toward table 7, his boots heavy on the polished wood. "Hey, buddy," he called out, his voice cutting through the ambient music. Johnny looked up from his plate, confusion flickering across his face. He'd been lost in thought, picking at his pasta, when this stranger approached with obvious hostility radiating from every pore. "I'm talking to you," Rick continued, his voice getting louder. "You think it's funny, sitting here pretending you can afford this place?" The nearby diners began to stare, their conversations dying away. Johnny's heart rate quickened, not from fear, but from the familiar dread of public confrontation. He'd hoped those days were behind him. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Johnny said quietly, his voice carrying that distinctive rasp that had charmed millions. But Rick was too angry to hear anything but what he wanted to hear. The distance between them closed as Rick stepped closer, his face flushed with righteous indignation. Johnny could smell the whiskey on his breath, could see the genuine anger in his eyes. This wasn't the calculated malice of a tabloid journalist or the desperate hunger of a paparazzi photographer. This was something rawer, more honest in its cruelty. "You're what's wrong with this country," Rick spat, his voice shaking with emotion. "People like you, taking advantage of honest folks, pretending to be something you're not." Johnny felt a familiar chill run down his spine. How many times had he heard those words, in different contexts, from different people? The irony was suffocating. "Misunderstanding?" Rick's voice rose to a shout. "The only misunderstanding is you thinking you can waltz in here and pretend to be something you're not. I've seen your type before, conning people, playing dress-up, thinking the world owes you something." Johnny slowly stood, his hands raised peacefully. "Sir, I think you've got the wrong. Don't you dare lie to me." Rick interrupted, his face flushed with rage. "I know a vagrant when I see one. You're probably stealing credit cards or running some scam. People like you make me sick." The restaurant fell completely silent. Even the kitchen staff peered out to see what was happening. Johnny felt the familiar weight of being judged, of being reduced to someone else's assumptions. But something was different this time. Instead of the usual celebrity harassment, this man genuinely believed Johnny was homeless, destitute, someone to be despised rather than adored. It was almost refreshing in its honesty, even as it stung. "I'm just trying to have dinner," Johnny said, his voice steady despite the chaos. Rick laughed bitterly. "Dinner? On whose dime? I bet you don't have 2 quarters to rub together, but here you are, ordering wine that costs more than most people's rent. It's people like you who make honest folks like me look bad." Johnny's throat tightened. The accusations were so far from the truth, yet they cut deep. Here was a man who had worked his whole life, who had built something with his hands, who had earned his place in the world through sweat and dedication. And he was looking at Johnny, someone who had achieved wealth and fame through talent and luck, as if he were the enemy. The cosmic joke of it all was almost too much to bear. The manager rushed over, his face pale with panic. "Mr. Brennan, please, I need you to calm down. This is a private establishment." "Private?" Rick laughed bitterly. "Then why are you letting street people eat here? This guy's obviously homeless. Look at him." He gestured wildly at Johnny, who stood there absorbing every word like physical blows. The irony wasn't lost on him. After years of being hounded by fans who wanted pieces of him, here was someone who wanted nothing more than to see him gone. Johnny's chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't name. Was it relief? Sadness? The strange freedom of being invisible, of being seen as nothing more than a problem to be solved? Marcus, the young waiter, stepped forward nervously. "Sir, this gentleman is a regular customer." "He's not. A regular?" Rick's eyes narrowed. "You're all in on this, aren't you? Probably gets kickbacks from whatever scam he's running." Johnny felt the walls closing in, the familiar suffocation of being trapped in someone else's narrative. But this time, the narrative was one of failure, of being discarded by society, of being invisible in all the wrong ways. He thought of his father, who had worked construction too, who had struggled to make ends meet, who had looked at wealth and success with the same mixture of resentment and suspicion he saw in Rick's eyes. The parallel was devastating. Here was a man who could have been his father, judging him not for his fame or his failures, but for his perceived lack of worth. The shame was different this time. Not the public shame of scandal, but the private shame of being seen as worthless, as someone who had given up on life itself. Johnny's mind raced as he tried to understand what was happening. In recent months, he deliberately cultivated anonymity, growing his hair out, dressing down, avoiding the spotlight. The legal battles had aged him, the stress had taken its toll, and he'd embraced a kind of studied invisibility. But had he gone too far? Did he really look like someone who lost everything? He caught his reflection in the restaurant's mirror, the hollow cheeks, the tired eyes, the clothes that hung loose on his frame. Maybe Rick wasn't entirely wrong about appearances. "Listen," Johnny said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I understand how this looks, but I'm not who you think I am." Rick scoffed. "Oh, let me guess. You're some kind of artist? A misunderstood genius? I've heard it all before, pal." The words hit deeper than Rick could have known. Johnny had spent decades being called those very things, and now here he was, stripped of all pretense, facing someone who saw only what was on the surface. Other diners began pulling out their phones, and Johnny's heart sank. This would be online within minutes, dissected and analyzed, turned into another chapter in his ongoing public drama. But for the first time in years, he wasn't the star of his own story. He was just a man being accused of being someone he wasn't, defending himself against charges that had nothing to do with his actual life. The manager whispered urgently into his phone, probably calling security. Marcus hovered nearby, his face a mask of confusion and concern. Johnny realized that none of these people knew what to do with this situation because it was so far outside their experience. They were used to managing celebrity problems, not homeless ones. Security arrived, 2 large men in dark suits who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Johnny watched Rick's face transform as he realized he was about to be removed from the restaurant. The construction worker's anger gave way to something else, a desperate kind of righteousness, as if he'd finally found his moment to stand up for all the working people who'd been stepped on by the system. "You're all protecting him," Rick shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "He's probably got some sob story about being down on his luck, and you're all falling for it." Johnny felt something shift inside him. Here was a man who was genuinely trying to do what he thought was right, who was fighting for principles he believed in, even if those principles were based on a complete misunderstanding. Rick wasn't evil. He was just tired, angry, and looking for someone to blame for a world that had gotten too complicated, too unfair. Johnny made a decision that surprised even himself. He stepped forward, placing himself between Rick and the security guards. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being heard. "Let him talk." The restaurant fell silent again, but this time it was different. Johnny wasn't running from the confrontation. He was embracing it. For the first time in months, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, facing exactly the conversation he needed to have. Rick stared at him, momentarily confused by this unexpected turn. Johnny looked directly into his eyes, seeing past the anger to the pain underneath. "You're right about one thing," Johnny said quietly. "I am pretending to be something I'm not, but maybe not in the way you think." The security guards hesitated, caught between their training and the strange energy that had suddenly filled the room. Johnny could feel the weight of every eye in the restaurant, but for once, he didn't care about the phone's recording or the social media posts that would follow. He was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being anything other than exactly who he was. "You want to know the truth?" Johnny said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You're looking at someone who lost everything that mattered. Not money, not fame, not any of the things you think I'm pretending to have. I lost my sense of self. I lost my dignity. I lost the ability to walk into a room without wondering what people were thinking about me." Rick's anger faltered, replaced by confusion. This wasn't the defensive response he'd expected. Johnny continued, his words coming from a place of raw honesty he'd forgotten existed. "You see someone pretending to be better than they are. I see someone who's forgotten how to be human." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Johnny realized he was having the conversation he'd been avoiding for years, not with a therapist or a friend, but with a stranger who had stripped away all his defenses by seeing him as nothing more than a problem to be solved. The irony was perfect and painful. He'd achieved the anonymity he'd craved, only to discover that invisibility was its own kind of prison. Rick's face showed the first cracks of uncertainty. Something in Johnny's voice and his presence was beginning to register as familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. A young woman at a nearby table gasped audibly, her phone sliding from her hands onto the floor. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice carrying in the hushed restaurant. That's Johnny Depp." The words hit Rick like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his face cycling through disbelief, recognition, and horror. Johnny watched the transformation, feeling strangely detached from his own identity being revealed. It was like watching someone else's life unfold in slow motion. "No," Rick breathed, his voice barely audible. "No, that's not. You can't be." But as he looked closer, as the anger cleared from his vision, the features became unmistakable. The cheekbones, the eyes, the way he held himself, it was all there, hidden beneath the exhaustion and the deliberately casual appearance. Johnny nodded slowly, a sad smile playing at his lips. "Hello, Rick." The restaurant erupted in whispers and gasps. Phones were everywhere now, capturing every moment of Rick's mortification. The construction worker from Pittsburgh, who had worked his whole life with his hands, had just spent the last 10 minutes screaming at one of the most famous actors in the world, calling him a vagrant and a fraud. Johnny felt no satisfaction in the revelation, only a deep sadness for both of them. "I'm sorry," Rick stammered, his face pale. "I didn't. I never." "You never what?" Johnny asked gently. "Thought you'd meet someone famous? Or thought you'd be wrong about who deserves to be where?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, but not a cruel one. Johnny was genuinely curious about the answer, about what this moment meant for both of them. Rick collapsed into the nearest chair, his head in his hands. 20 minutes ago, he'd been the righteous defender of working-class values. Now he was the fool who'd mistaken Captain Jack Sparrow for a homeless con artist. But Johnny didn't see a fool. He saw a mirror. "You know what the funny thing is?" Johnny said, taking the seat across from Rick. "You weren't entirely wrong. I am pretending to be something I'm not. I've been pretending to be okay, pretending to be strong, pretending that everything that's happened to me hasn't broken me into pieces." Rick looked up, his eyes red with embarrassment and something deeper. "But you're rich. You're famous. You've got everything." Johnny laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've got money, Rick. I've got fame. But I haven't had a peaceful meal in a restaurant in years." I haven't had a stranger treat me like a regular person since I was your daughter's age. You gave me something tonight that I haven't had in decades. You saw me as just another guy. A guy with problems, maybe, but just a guy. The revelation seemed to hit Rick like a physical weight. He'd spent the evening angry at someone he thought was beneath him, only to discover he'd been talking to someone he'd assumed was above him. The cosmic joke of it all was almost too much to process. I worked construction too, Johnny said quietly. Before all this, I know what it's like to earn every dollar with your hands, to be tired in your bones, to wonder if you're falling behind while other people seem to have it easy. Rick stared at him, seeing something he'd missed before, not the celebrity or the vagrant, but the man underneath it all. Why didn't you tell me? Rick asked, his voice hollow. Why did you let me go on like that? Johnny considered the question, tracing the rim of his wine glass with one finger. Because you were talking to who I really am, not who people think I am. When was the last time someone was that honest with me? When was the last time someone told me exactly what they thought without wanting something from me? Rick shook his head, still struggling to process what had happened. But I was so wrong. I made assumptions. I judged you. You judged what you saw, Johnny corrected. And what you saw was someone who looked lost, who looked like he'd given up. You weren't wrong about that part. I have been lost. I have given up, in a lot of ways. The restaurant had returned to its normal volume, but Johnny could feel the weight of continued observation. Marcus approached cautiously, refilling water glasses they didn't need, clearly wanting to be part of whatever was happening at table 7. The thing is, Johnny continued, I've been so focused on what people think of me, on managing my image, on controlling the narrative, that I forgot what it felt like to just be a person. Tonight, for the first time in years, someone looked at me and saw a regular guy with problems. Yeah, you thought I was a different kind of guy with different kinds of problems, but the core of it was the same. You saw someone struggling. Rick's embarrassment was giving way to something else, a kind of recognition, a meeting of minds across the vast divide of their different worlds. You really worked construction? He asked. Johnny nodded. Laid rebar, poured concrete, came home with cement under my fingernails. My back still remembers those days. The two men sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of their misunderstanding settling between them like dust after a storm. Johnny signaled Marcus for another bottle of wine, then looked at Rick with genuine curiosity. Tell me about your daughter's wedding. That's why you're in town, right? Rick blinked, surprised by the subject change. Tomorrow afternoon. She's marrying a lawyer. Good kid, treats her well, but he's never worked a day of physical labor in his life. Sometimes I wonder if she's embarrassed by her old man. Johnny heard the echo of his own fears in Rick's voice. You know what I've learned about embarrassment? It's usually about our own insecurities, not about how other people actually see us. Your daughter probably thinks you're the strongest man in the world. Rick's eyes softened. She used to tell people her dad could build anything. My daddy can build a house, she'd say. Made me feel 10 feet tall. She still feels that way, Johnny said with certainty. Trust me, I know something about daughters. They talked through the night. Two men from different worlds discovering they shared the same fundamental struggles. Rick told Johnny about 23 years of construction work, about the pride and the pain of building things with his hands. Johnny told Rick about the loneliness of fame, about the way success could isolate you from the very experiences that made you human. As the restaurant prepared to close around them, they'd built something unexpected, not friendship exactly, but understanding. Rick had come to LA carrying resentment about a world that seemed to reward the wrong people. Johnny had come to this restaurant carrying shame about who he'd become. Both men left carrying something different. As they stood to leave, Rick extended his hand. I owe you an apology, not just for tonight, but for thinking I knew who you were based on how you looked. Johnny shook his hand, feeling the calluses earned through decades of honest work. You don't owe me anything, Rick. You gave me something I didn't know I needed. What's that? The chance to be nobody special for a little while. Rick looked confused, so Johnny explained. For the past few years, every interaction I've had has been colored by who people think I am. Tonight, you talked to me like I was just another guy. Even when you were angry with me, it was about what you thought I'd done, not about what you'd read in the tabloids. They walked toward the door together, an unlikely pair united by their shared humanity. Rick paused at the threshold. You know, I came here tonight angry at the world. Angry at people who seemed to have it easy. Angry at a system that seemed unfair. But you've been through things I can't even imagine. Public humiliation, legal battles, people picking apart every word you say. And you're still here, still trying to be a decent person. Johnny smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in months. We're all just trying to figure it out as we go along, Rick. The construction worker and the movie star were not that different. We both know what it's like to build something, to have it fall down, and to have to start over. Rick nodded, understanding passing between them like a shared secret. Good luck with everything, he said. I hope things get easier for you. Good luck with the wedding, Johnny replied. And Rick, your daughter's lucky to have you. Alone in his car, Johnny sat in the restaurant parking lot, his hands shaking slightly as he processed what had happened. He thought about his own father, who had died before Johnny's career took off, before the fame and the fortune and the complications that came with both. His father had been a man like Rick, practical, hardworking, suspicious of people who seemed to get something for nothing. Johnny wondered what his father would have thought of the man he'd become, of the choices he'd made, of the life he'd built. He remembered being 12 years old, watching his father come home from work, exhausted and covered in dirt, counting out bills at the kitchen table. His father had looked at the television with the same mixture of resentment and fascination that Rick had shown tonight. Not hatred, exactly, but a kind of bewildered frustration at a world that seemed to operate by different rules. Those people don't live in the real world, his father used to say, watching actors on late-night talk shows. They don't know what it's like to work for a living. Johnny had promised himself he'd never forget where he came from, never lose touch with the reality his father had known. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten. He'd gotten lost in the maze of fame and fortune and public opinion. Tonight, Rick had reminded him of something essential, that beneath all the celebrity and scandal, he was still just a man trying to make sense of his place in the world. The reminder had been painful, but it had also been necessary. Johnny started his car and drove home, carrying with him the memory of an honest conversation in a world that had forgotten how to be honest. That night changed everything for both men. Rick learned that his assumptions about success and struggle were more complicated than he'd imagined. Johnny learned that being seen as human, even when that humanity was messy and imperfect, was worth more than any amount of fame or fortune. Their story reminds us that we're all just people trying to figure out our place in the world, whether we're building houses or building characters on screen. Sometimes the most important conversations happen with strangers who aren't afraid to tell us the truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. The construction worker and the movie star discovered they had more in common than either could have imagined. Both knew what it meant to work hard, to doubt themselves, to wonder if they were enough. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the assumptions you make about others, then I've done my job. These are the kinds of raw, untold stories that remind us of our shared humanity. They're stories about real people behind the headlines, about the moments that change us when we least expect it. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because there are so many more stories like this one. Stories about celebrities, about ordinary people, about the extraordinary moments that happen when two worlds collide. These aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that we're all more alike than we are different. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for seeing the humanity in both Rick and Johnny. And remember, the next time you make an assumption about someone based on how they look or what you think you know about them, think about this night in a Los Angeles restaurant where two strangers found something real in the most unexpected place. #TheStranger at Table 7.